For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. This is the word of the Lord. This is the only passage that anybody ever reads in Ecclesiastes. One commentary that I read this week mentioned that people find Ecclesiastes to be a dark, depressing book, and therefore nobody reads it. Since it begins with the oft-quoted phrase, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," which is easily translated as "life is pointless," and it continues on at some length like this, nobody really wants to read it. And since nobody wants to read about that, the passage that we read today is lifted up out of the rest so that a bunch of hippies can write songs about it, and the rest of Ecclesiastes is relegated to those dark, mysterious sections of the Bible that nobody really understands, like Job or the early parts of Genesis, which happen to be the only other things I've ever preached on. Now, about Ecclesiastes, I will save you all some time. I have read the rest of the book, and it really is that depressing. But let's talk for a moment about exactly where this book is in the Bible. You know that the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, is divided into three distinct sections. The first, the Torah, are those first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They tell the story of the whole history of the world and how the Hebrews were brought out of slavery and came to have God's law. The second part is called the prophets, and this section is divided into 2 parts. The first part is a history of the Hebrews after they had the law, which mostly talks about how they repeatedly break the law. The second part of the prophets is called the latter prophets, and it's a bunch of prophetic writings writing to Israel about how angry they are that Israel keeps breaking the law. The last part is called the writings, and thank goodness it has nothing to do with the law. The writings could lovingly be called the etc. section of the Bible. We have Psalms about God's love. We have the Proverbs, which extol wisdom. We have Esther, which is a story about God's people that doesn't even mention God. And there's the Song of Songs, which talks about stuff we can't talk about in church. I love the writings because rather than talk sternly about who God is and what God does, instead, we get to see people struggling to live in a world where God has made himself known. The writings are not about the law, and they're not about God. They're about us. The authors of these passages are writing for the same reason that you and I are in this building right now. They have been moved by a message of God to think about their lives and live their lives in a different way. And the Jews thought that these wildly different versions of reacting to God's word were worth hearing about and put them in the Bible for us to read today, 2,000 years later. Ecclesiastes, then, is not a dire, depressing statement from God. Instead, what we have are the struggles of an individual like you and me trying to understand why we are here and why things happen in life. The poem that begins the lectionary reading for today hardly needs repeating. It's a very poetic rendering of one very simple thought. Good things happen, bad things happen, both will continue to happen, but time moves on. As is traditional in Tulsa during Christmas, there is a radio station every year that plays nothing but 24-hour Christmas music until Christmas Day. And this year was no exception, and the station, of course, had a very, very short playlist consisting mainly of a few selections from The Carpenters, Mannheim Steamroller, and, of course, the endless, ear-wrenching repetition of Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You, baby. Whether or not you like Christmas music more than the station's usual offering of 60s and 70s rock is completely irrelevant. Now, Christmas Day at my family was a little bit disrupted because generally we have relatives that come in from Oklahoma City, but there was a little bit of question about the weather this year, and so they ended up not coming, and Christmas evening at my house then was pretty chill, and everyone else had already gone to bed, and I was up in my room by myself, and I had gotten a new pair of headphones for Christmas. And I said, ooh, I'm going to try the new headphones, and so I tuned into the radio through the internet and was listening to the Christmas music, and finally it was midnight. And Bing Crosby was singing, Do You Hear What I Hear? And after Bing Crosby finished, the radio station said, gave its call letters and said, listen to our station, we're great. And then suddenly it was playing Carly Simon singing, You Belong to Me. Christmas was over. There is a time for Christmas music, and there is a time for Carly Simon. As always at New Year's, there are top 10 lists that are made about stuff that happened in 2012, and one of them that my mother was reading to me was a top 10 list of news stories that had happened in the previous year. Unsurprisingly, the first one was about the economy. Now, I wish I could tell you that there is a time for the economy and a time for something else other than the economy, but I'm pretty sure the economy is going to stay around whether we like it or not. But number 2 was the presidential election. I've already stopped thinking about the presidential election. I don't want to think about the presidential election anymore. If I remember correctly, the presidential election was a rather nasty effort that brought out the worst in everybody involved. And then on a Tuesday in November, we did the only thing that really mattered, which is that we voted. And after the votes were counted, Mitt Romney stood up, said, thank you for voting for me, and took his family to Disney World. Then Barack Obama stood up and said, thank you for voting for me, and took his family to the White House. And the nation continued. In a few weeks, there's going to be an inauguration ceremony, and that will be the end of that. There's a time for elections, and there's a time for inaugurations. I'll give you one more example. 65.5 million years and 1 year ago, if we looked out the window, we would not see buildings, we would not see cars, we would not see people. What instead we would see are dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are who ruled the earth before the mammals came along and came into prominence, and the mammals became us. And the reason that there are no more dinosaurs is that 65.5 million years ago, an asteroid from outer space slammed into South America. It shot up dust into the air and covered the sky in blackness so that the sun couldn't shine in. This means that most of the plant life died, and therefore most of the lower things on the food chain died, and of course the things at the very top of the food chain, the dinosaurs, perished. Eventually, though, the sky stopped being dark, the sun came back out, the earth was green again. There's a time for dinosaurs, and there's a time for humans. For millions and millions of years, from dinosaurs to presidential elections to Christmas, things have been coming and going, for good and for bad. Everything has its time, and then that time goes away, and something else comes along. I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. This line really stuck out at me when I was reading to prepare for the sermon. There's something very comforting about work. I went on a mission trip this week with the college-age group, and what we did was work. Me and Grant Carpenter managed to fix several leaky pipes for some of the faucets that were around the camp. There were people that moved furniture. There were people that painted. We sorted clothes. All these sort of hands-on activities that you have to do for mission work. And it's very gratifying to do this work, even though it's in itself not particularly important, but in the grand scheme of things, you know that you're doing this really great thing. Now, in fact, when God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they were put there to work. What human beings are called to do is to work. God has given us business to attend to. One of the things that I'm still holding, and I'm sure a lot of you are still holding, from last year are the attacks at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut. When you're a seminarian, and I assume when you're a pastor as well, tragedies like this one enter your brain through a particular type of filter. On one hand, you're concerned about the things you really should be concerned about, such as the family and friends of the victim and perpetrator. But there's this other little part of you that's thinking, how are people going to react to this theologically? And within a few hours of hearing the news about what had happened, my brain was thinking one thing: the bad theology is coming. And I was right. By the end of the week, several famous people had interpreted the event in several different ways. It was the conjecture of a few people that because the United States government said that teachers couldn't allow prayer in schools, that was why the shooting had happened. That God had either allowed or, even more scarily, ordained the shooting to occur. But then people on the other end of this spectrum were saying that, well, no good God could allow something like this to happen, and therefore there must be no God at all. Now, I don't profess to understand the relationship between evil and God. Theologians have been struggling with this very topic for thousands and thousands of years. And there are some answers, and some are better than others. But I don't think either of these ways of viewing the situation are particularly helpful. Here's what I think. We could spend all day and most of the next few days talking about the theological ramifications of tragedy. And I'm a seminarian. I love to talk about just that sort of thing. But this is not what we're meant to do. The Lord did not command us saying, argue endlessly about the theology of good and evil. The Lord did not command us saying, anyone who thinks this particular way about me is wrong. What God has instructed us to do is this: love our neighbor, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. Bad things happen, good things happen. But God has given us business to be busy with. Last thing. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. Ecclesiastes might be depressing in bits, but this line is pretty uplifting. In a few minutes, we'll get the chance to take things from last year that we're glad to be rid of. We'll get to burn them in these pots right here and offer them up to God. It's a chance for renewal. It's a clean slate. There is a time for hardship. There is a time for hurt and for grief. But that time is not forever. God's intent for us is not to languish in hurt. God's intent for us is to enjoy our work, to eat and drink and take pleasure in our toil. And now can be the start of that. And that's not depressing at all.